Kick-ass facts, our last episode on experiments. Pew pew pew! Dr. Yu and Cameron believed the brain could be reprogrammed to think in healthy ways by forcibly imposing new thought patterns on it. His method was to make patients wear headphones and listen to audio messages over and over, sometimes for days or even weeks at a time. He called this method psychic driving because the messages were being driven into the psyche. The press hailed it as beneficial brainwashing. He thought he could cure schizophrenia this way. During the 1950s and early 1960s, hundreds of Cameron's patients became his unwitting test subjects, whether or not they actually had schizophrenia. Some patients checked themselves in, complaining of problems as minor as menopause-related anxiety. It was probably their husbands who checked them in, because they had opinions. Only to find themselves sedated with barbiturates, strapped into a bed, and forced to listen for days on end to messages like, "People like you and need you, you have confidence in yourself." One time, to test the technique, Cameron placed patients into a drugged sleep and made them listen to the message, "When you see a piece of paper, you'll want to pick it up." Later, he drove them to a local gymnasium. There, lying in the middle of the gym floor, was a single piece of paper. He happily reported that many of them spontaneously walked over and picked it up. When the CIA learned of what Cameron was doing, it became interested and started channeling him money, but eventually the agency concluded that Cameron's technique was a failure and cut his funding, prompting Cameron himself to admit that his experiments had been a 10-year trip down the wrong road. In the late 1970s, a group of Cameron's former patients sued the CIA for support of his work and reached an out-of-court settlement for an undisclosed amount of money. History contains several accounts of children being raised by animals, and the children in such cases often behave more animal than human, even after being returned to human society. This made psychologist Winthrop Kellogg wonder what would happen if the situation were reversed. What if an animal were raised by and as a human? To answer this question, in 1931, Kellogg brought a 7-month-old female chimpanzee named Gua into his home. He and his wife then proceeded to raise Gua as though she were human alongside their 10-month-old son. They treated them exactly the same. They played together, they were fed together, and they were subjected to the same tests to track their development. One such test was a suspended cookie test, in which the Kellogg's timed how long it took their children to reach a cookie suspended by a string in the middle of the room. Gua regularly performed better on such tests than Donald, but in terms of language acquisition, she was a disappointment. Despite the Kellogg's repeated efforts, the ability to speak eluded her. Disturbingly, it also seemed to elude Donald. 9 months into the experiment, his language skills weren't much better than Gua's. When he one day indicated he was hungry by imitating Gua's food bark, the Kellogg's decided the experiment had run its course. Donald eventually needed some playmates of his own species, and on March 28, 1932, they shipped Gua back to the primate center. Male turkeys aren't fussy. Give them a lifelike model of a female turkey and they will happily try to mate with it. This observation made Martin Sheen and Edgar Hale of the University of Pennsylvania curious about what might be the minimal stimulus required to excite a turkey. I mean, haven't we all thought that? They embarked on a series of experiments to find out. This involved removing parts from a turkey model one by one until the male turkey eventually lost interest. Tail, feet, and wings were removed, but still the male bird waddled up to the model and tried to do his thing. I don't know if that's what turkeys sound like. Finally, the researchers were left with a head on a stick, and surprisingly, the turkey still showed signs of interest. In fact, it preferred a head on a stick over a headless body. Don't we all? In 1978, psychologist Russell Clark persuaded the students of his social psychology class to help him find out who, in a real-life situation, would be more receptive to a sexual offer from a stranger. The only way to find out, he figured, was to actually get out there and see what would happen. So young men and women from his class found out across campus and propositioned strangers. "I've been noticing you around campus. I find you to be very attractive. Would you go to bed with me tonight?" The results were predictable. 75% of guys were happy to oblige an attractive woman. The few who said no typically offered an excuse, such as "I'm married," but not a single woman accepted the identical offer from an attractive male. In fact, most of them demanded the guy leave her alone. Last one. Leo Stanley, and it's a doozy. Leo Stanley, the physician in charge at San Quentin Prison in California, surgically transplanted the testicles of executed criminals into living inmates. Stanley felt that the males who committed crimes shared a common characteristic, low testosterone levels, and raising it would reduce the crime rate. More than 600 inmates became the victim of Stanley's crazy theory, and when there was a shortage of human testicles, as there often is, he went on to inject liquefied animal testicles into the prisoners. Stanley claimed that the experiment was a success by citing a prisoner who felt energetic after transplanting the testicle from an executed convict. That's how horror movies get started.